But good evening once again, and welcome to tonight's event for the launch of issue 3 of Manifest Journal. I am delighted that we are hosting the first event of many Manifest events this semester happening in many schools and institutions across the Americas. For those of you, joining from outside UVA, I am Felipe Correa, professor and chair of the Department of Architecture. In addition to being a panelist, I am also serving as the master of ceremonies for tonight's event. So I also need to remind you that the YouTube live live chat is active. And if you have questions as we go through the event, please type them. You do need to be signed in to YouTube via Google to be able to do that. Before we move into the specifics of the event, I do want to make a special acknowledgement to Sneha Patel, Director of Communications at the School of Architecture, for helping us put together this event, and to Tal Ares, who has prepared a more graphically enhanced viewing experience for tonight via YouTube Live in order to get us out of the ubiquitous Zoom grid. I'm not exactly sure what Tal will be doing, but he did say he was going to make me look 10 years younger. So, of course, I immediately agreed to this plan. It is an honor for me to introduce Anthony Achavati and Dan Handel tonight, who, along with Justin Fowler, who spoke here at UVA about Manifest a couple of years back, make up the founding editorial team of Manifest. Manifest is a carefully curated print journal that is attentive to the most pressing issues that are currently shaping the architecture, cities, and hinterlands of the Americas. Bring together many disciplines and forms of expression: architecture, literature, the sciences, the plastic arts, etc. Manifest goes beyond singular notions of what constitutes America, presenting layered perspectives carefully edited into a single volume. Issue 3, titled Bigger Than Big, that we are celebrating here tonight, examines notions of immensity across the Americas, a theme that is also central to the expertise and interest of many of our faculty here at UVA. Therefore, it's no coincidence that issue 3 has close to 10 UVA School of Architecture affiliated contributors. Anthony Achavati is an architect and a historian who currently holds the Daniel Rose Visiting Professorship at the Yale School of Architecture. He is the author of the book Ganges Water Machine, the first environmental history of the Ganges River seen through the lens of cities and infrastructure, which in 2016 received the J.B. Jackson Book Award from the Foundation for Landscape Studies. His forthcoming book, Building a Republic of Villages, will be released in 2022. Dan Handel is an architect and curator whose work focuses on research-based exhibitions with special attention to underexplored ideas, figures, and practices that shape contemporary built environments. He was the inaugural young curator at the Canadian Centre for Architecture in Montreal, has developed exhibitions for the Venice Biennial and the New Institute in Rotterdam, and was curator of architecture and design at the Israel Museum. Please join me in welcoming Anthony and Dan, who will introduce the panelists and guide tonight's conversation. Welcome.
Thank you, Felipe, for the introduction and for offering to host this remote launch of Manifest number 3 on the theme of Reconsidering Immensity at the School of Architecture at the University of Virginia. This is the first of many launches that we will be doing from New Haven and Lima to Chicago, Mexico City, Cambridge, New York, Princeton, and many others. And thank you not only to the contributors that are here tonight who have graciously assembled here today and who we will introduce shortly, but also many thanks to Sneha Patel, Director of Communications at the School of Architecture, who has kindly collaborated with us on this experiment. And a big thank you to Tal Ares, a designer based in Tel Aviv, who is producing the event and to whom we are extremely grateful. And many thanks to all of you for joining us this evening. As Felipe mentioned to you, Manifest is an independent print journal dedicated to the art, architecture, and landscapes of the Americas. Founded by myself, along with Dan Handel and Justin Fowler, to initiate what we hope is a critical and imaginative conversation about the Americas. We have been described by some as the first literary journal of architecture, and we like this description because for us, Manifest provides an opportunity for placing historical work in dialogue with contemporary subjects, projective tracks, and admitted fictions. The journal is as much a venue for literary experimentation as analytical investigation. And we have been fortunate to receive the support of the Graham Foundation, anonymous donors and benefactors, as well as a readership that extends across the globe from Thailand to Peru and from Canada to Indonesia. While we maintain an active online presence, and you can find more about us and our issues on our website, we remain fiercely committed to print as a medium of exchange of ideas and experiences. Our first two issues focus respectively on definitions of Americanness in the built environment and on the complex theme of religion and space throughout the Americas. Issue number 3, titled Bigger Than Big, focuses on the physical dimension of the continent, its landscapes, and its material imaginaries. And it is why this evening we are gathered to reconsider this bigger than big and to ask, in short, what does it mean to grapple with the immensity of the Americas? Issue number 3 provides some clues to that question, and perhaps appropriately, it is our largest issue yet, with 50 contributors and 280 pages.
And in this context, perhaps we should add that our deliberate use of the term Americas acquires further significance. Of course, the stuff of the continent transcends political borders, which expands our horizon from the plains of Patagonia to the Arctic Circle. But the term also connotes the multiplicity that exists within a given territory, an uneasy layering of environments, peoples, and ideologies that cannot be summarized in an executive brief of presidential campaigns, but has to be excavated, reflected upon, and constantly reimagined. So this evening's conversation will highlight propositions that have taken seriously the bigger than big, as we call it, design and representational experiments aimed at narrating, framing, or enacting the American continent and the forms and ideas which it animates. For this evening, we have organized our panelists into 3 categories, namely matter, description, and reimagination. We will briefly introduce each of the speakers with the bios they shared with us for publication, briefly describe their published piece, and then ask each of them a series of questions. Once we have asked questions of all 3 groups, we will then be happy to accept questions from the audience via, as Felipe mentioned, via the YouTube live page. And to that end, let us introduce the first panel and our exciting panelists. So welcome and thanks for being with us again today. So for our first section, which will focus on matter, we're joined by Ila Berman, who is Dean of the School of Architecture, and Edward E. Elson Professor at the University of Virginia. Ila is an architect, theorist, and curator of architecture and urbanism, whose research investigates the relationship between culture and the evolution of contemporary material, technological, and spatial practices. And Felipe Correa, who is an architect and founding partner of the design studio Somatic Collaborative. He's the Vincent and Eleanor Shea Professor and Chair of the Department of Architecture at the University of Virginia. Correa is the author of multiple books on architecture and urbanism, including São Paulo, a graphic biography, Beyond the City, and Mexico City, Between Geometry and Geography. Kristi Cheramie, hi, who is an associate professor and chair of undergraduate studies in landscape architecture at Ohio State University. Her research employs alternate practices of spatial history to explore erasure, loss, and forgetting as powerful agents of change in the landscape, using speculation as a tool to reconstruct the historical systems, scales, and materials that comprise a landscape. She looks to design to reveal the interconnections between story, memory, ground, and time. Her work tracks patterns of adaptability and transformation in the landscape, with a particular focus on efforts aimed at mitigating or eliminating change. And Matthew Seibert, who is principal and co-founder of Landscape Metrics and the company's creative lead. He is currently an assistant professor of landscape architecture at the University of Virginia's School of Architecture. So Felipe and Ila, Kristi and Matthew, in each of your contributions, you have all dealt with the power of human imagination to transform the land itself. And this is what we'd like to explore a little bit in this panel. So in revisiting your work in this issue, we're reminded of Willa Cather's My Antonia from 1918, where she writes that, quote, "There was nothing but land, not a country at all, but the material out of which countries are made," end quote. While this paragraph is about early 20th century Nebraska, it seems to capture the imagination that many had and maybe still have of much of the Americas as a whole. Framing land as primordial is often overwhelming, but it is in the specific encounters it allows with immensity that matter is being transformed into human enterprise. Felipe and Ila, in the conversation between the two of you about Felipe's book, Beyond the City, Resource Extraction, Urbanism in South America, you two discuss how the extraction of matter determined the rationale of settlement and urbanization throughout much of the South America's supposed hinterlands. And in the case of Kristi and Matthew, you draw our attention to the lower Mississippi River Basin with your parafictional history in which the diversion of water spawns a flurry of bureaucratic paperwork and amazing engineering energy. So we have the same questions for all four of you. First, could you each speak of the ways in which infrastructure is related with the idea of dealing with the matter of the continent, whether by extraction, manipulation, or transportation? And second, what would be the specific qualities of the continent that feed the narration of your accounts? Perhaps Felipe and Ila could answer first, and then we turn to Kristi and Matthew.
Very good. So, well, first of all, thank you, Dan and Anthony, for the question. Maybe I'll speak very briefly, give a quick answer to contextualize South America, and then sort of maybe we can establish a larger dialogue. But I think in order to address your question, it is important to understand what the most dominant narrative of a new frontier was in the context of the South American continent. If in the context of the United States, notions of a new frontier, especially a colonial new frontier, involved the gradual advancement of settlement westward, in South America, a similar notion actually existed, but it was conceived as a gradual movement towards the interior of the continent, with Amazonia as its epicenter. In fact, William Chandless in 1854 proposed to construct the Great South American Canal. And this proposal exemplifies this notion. This was a major hydrological infrastructure that would unify the three major South American rivers, the Orinoco, the Amazon, and the Paraná, into a grand canal that would connect the resource-rich interior with global markets. Well, the canal was never really built. The canal project exemplifies a coast-hinterland dynamic where resources from the interior are brought into key port cities that control capital and then distributed to global markets. This dynamic that is still very present today set the stage for an incredible laboratory of ex novo cities built from scratch throughout the course of the 20th century. So in this context, I would argue against perhaps one of these premises within your initial question or initial framework, which is that territorial networks were solely built based on the logics of resource extraction. I would argue that economies of resource extraction established a canvas for a series of experimental projects where architecture played a pivotal role in defining how societies were inscribed and administered, bringing many other spatial values beyond those shaped by the utilitarian nature of the resource extraction process itself. These ranged from the construction of Belo Horizonte, for example, a brand new state capital tasked with constructing a new Brazilian subject through architecture and urbanism, to the construction of full services, autonomous cities in the Atacama Desert, one of the most barren geographies on the face of the earth. So in that context, I think today, it is very important to also question how the disciplines of architecture and landscape architecture, also a very important aspect, sort of discipline within this context, should approach this territory today. In a context where notions of primordial land have been debunked, it's known now that, for example, the Amazon was historically much more urban than what we thought previously, and that very large populations lived within this context. So I think this idea of primordial land has to be rethought. I think there's another concept that's very important that has to be rethought, which is that we no longer live under developmentalist government mindsets, which fueled a lot of the projects that are actually documented in the book. So in this context, for me, the larger question that I would put on the table is, what are the larger imaginaries that the design disciplines can advance, given the larger sort of set of territorial networks that resource extraction has put as a canvas within the landscape. And maybe with that, I'll ask Ila to continue the conversation.
Thanks, Felipe. I mean, my conversation with Felipe in the journal focused on how infrastructural logics and territorial dynamics have participated in the formative processes of cities in South America, the subject of his book, Beyond the City. I'm going to take a slight detour from our conversation. I wanted to first perhaps talk about infrastructure not as a material thing, a system of public works for the extraction and conveyance of material, for example, but as an abstract framework and organizational system that operates to capture and contain matter in order to instrumentalize it, which is part of what we do within our disciplines. That infrastructure is first a form of conceptual manipulation before it becomes an actual one. And since I'm sitting looking out onto the lawn at the academical village of Jefferson, I'm going to go a little bit north. You know, the Americas provided for Europe an uncharted territory upon which they could project ideated forms of making cities that weren't possible at the time in Europe, because they had to deal with the reality of embodied cities that were already made, that evolved incrementally over time, and certainly were far from being ordered or ideal. And in the new world of the Americas, these ideated forms and systems were devices of colonization by Europeans who were strongly motivated by the desire to increase wealth through the extensive appropriation and capitalization of natural resources through agriculture, forestry, mining, etc. The Americas were seen as immense territories of infinite expansion, industriousness, and opportunity. And I like the notion of immensity and how we engage with that idea of immensity. But these were instrumentalized by infrastructures that were first conceptualized or formalized as frameworks of organization, extraction, and conveyance before becoming real. So I'm going to use the example of Thomas Jefferson. One of his great inventions, of course, was the Land Ordinance Act, of 1784, and the grid that mapped and divided up 4/5 of the continent, which was a strategy first to capture, colonize, and settle an immense unknown and unseen territory. The nation became knowable first and was first instantiated, we could say, as a nation through the map and its gridded infrastructure. And so this is not a material infrastructure per se, but a formal one. And these are the devices, obviously, that we use not just within mapping and cartography, but within architectural design. And whether this is at the scale of the territorial landscape or the city block, the grid in its agricultural and urban formations, and these were tied together as they were in South America, operated as a political and economic instrument and was repeated ad infinitum despite enormous differences in the topographies, the climates, and the cultures that the grid encountered, or the programs and materials that filled it. So it was an infrastructural instrument of material conquest, an instrument of cultivation and extraction, but for Jefferson, it was also an instrument of democracy. Jefferson believed that the wealth of a nation was in fact its land and the cultivation of that land. So the modern grid becomes the perfect instrument of colonization in the New World Order in relation to this extended and immense landscape. It's an a priori numerical net, an implicit organizational structure, and that would come to define the underlying logic of spatial distribution and the playing field, I would say, of the American landscape. And the interesting thing about the grid understood as an infrastructure is that it is infinitely extendable as an idea. And of course, it also migrated from Jefferson's relationship to France and French rationalism. But that's how it confronted the immensity of the landscape. So within this, we can talk now. I'm interested in the places, let's say, of material resistance. If we look, for example, at the grid of state boundaries, any edge that is not orthogonal is either an edge of a major river or lake, a mountain range, a swamp, or a coast. The idea that it's only where the intensity of matter, because of its obdurate or fluid nature or the complexity of its geography, becomes resistant to the infrastructural system that's overlaid upon it. And that to me becomes a kind of core concept, that the matter contained in each site and plot determined the resource that would be exploited, whether this was through agriculture in the plains and valleys or mining and forestry in the mountains. So in its two dominant forms, infrastructure becomes either an organizational system of capture for material exploitation of the land, or a network of conveyance for trade. And at the more specific level, it's the geographies and materialities of these sites that determine the more particular forms of infrastructure that interact with it. In the same way that we could say that water infrastructure of dams, aqueducts, and reservoirs follow the movement of water itself. And I think that in some ways this speaks to the imaginaries of the design disciplines that Felipe, that you ended with, because for me, those are our instruments, our infrastructural instruments that we operate with by transforming the landscape first through those devices.
So yeah, just to bring up the questions again. So first, we're wondering what is the role, or what are the roles that infrastructure plays in a sense of its relation to the idea of dealing with the matter, with the stuff of the continents. And the second question would be, and I think it's very relevant in your sort of parafictional narrative, Kristi and Matthews, how would these specific qualities of the material of the continent feature in the narrative, or even shape the narrative, the narration of your accounts of what you wrote for us, or how you think of landscapes of the continent in general?
Yeah, thanks so much. It's great to be here. Great to be back within the School of Architecture. I'll kick things off on behalf of both of us and then hand it over to Matthew. So we're working in the lower Mississippi River Basin, and that's essentially the area from Cairo, Illinois, down to the Gulf of Mexico, and thinking about the decision-making around infrastructure that was happening in the early 20th century. So flood control infrastructure at this time to the Army Corps of Engineers was essentially a long-term improvisational project to translate the immensity of a river into sublime, architecturalized expressions of power. And what's interesting about this is the expressions of power were naively believed to be equivalent with control. And therein lies the paradox where our work seeks to mine and dig in and understand how those differences manifest in different types of actions and different types of artifacts. So within the core, each piece of infrastructure contributed to the collective belief that it was somehow possible to build a transactional relationship with the river, one in which obvious environmental dynamics could be confined to discrete interactions at structured points, so like floodgates or levees or later pump stations. And what's important to keep in mind here is the sheer immensity of a river basin in motion, constantly in motion. It is a socio-ecological juggernaut that was and remains impossibly complex to digest and impossibly complex in order to fully make decisions around. Yet this is the proposition that the Corps took on and claimed to do that with authority. So meeting the complexity of this basin in motion in the early 20th century meant entering into a kind of environmental arms race with the Mississippi River. And Jed Purdy writes about this fairly eloquently, and he talks about how much of US history is wrapped up in literal, quote unquote, literal landscape making. And I think this is a particularly relevant note when thinking about core infrastructure. So our project looks at both the artifacts and the possible artifacts that are generated as an early 20th century core grapples with its own relationship to the immensity of the river. Our work is particularly interested in the idea of, in how the idea or the ideal of control often got in the way of more radical notions of how infrastructure could in fact operate in the American landscape. So I'll kick it to Matthew to talk about maybe an example of this around in the aftermath of the 1927 flood.
So yeah, I mean, in response to the question about sort of the specific qualities of the continent that feed the narration, our answer again sort of returns to the previous comments about this improvisational nature of the Army Corps operations in the early 20th century. And so if we think about the lower Mississippi River Basin, a territory essentially as large as a continent, rather as an assemblage of local geographies and local effects from continental systems, we can begin to kind of understand a federal institution that would have been constantly pulled between, on one hand, kind of instances, moments, and acute symptoms, and then on the other hand, sort of trajectories, multi-generational kind of durations, and continent-spanning systems. And so with the Mississippi River Basin, the Corps was essentially trying to instrumentalize a hyperobject, to use Tim Morton's concept of objects that are so massively distributed in time and space so as to kind of transcend localization. They were trying to instrumentalize this object, the basin, through infrastructure. And it shouldn't be totally surprising that this left institutions scrambling in any number of ways. And namely, I mean, how to document the spaces, the materials, and the behaviors of this hyperobject. And so the Corps archives then kind of holds the documents and records that illustrate the intermediary steps through which the Corps attempted to meet the scale and capacity of the hyperobject through acts of design and construction. And so our work specifically sort of focuses on particular moments of indecision or debate within this reckoning, within the sort of moment of reckoning, or this sort of era of reckoning. And so, for example, when the idea of a spillway was first debated, contested, and visualized within the Army Corps of Engineers, there was a whole debate between sort of a spillways only policy and something more that would include, levies only policies and a policy that would include spillways as a sort of release valve of kind of directional control. And so ultimately, by introducing parafictional documents to that record of events, we can tease out the potential multiples. We can recover erased spaces and memories, or even sort of test unfulfilled spatial trajectories, meaning we can expand notions of the capacity of infrastructure to really shape our memory and code our future. We'll leave you with that cliffhanger as well.
If I can ask a follow-up question very quick, does this become also a form of critique for you two?
Kristi, you want to jump in, or?
Yeah, I think fundamentally we were interested in looking at parafiction as a tool to critique historical decision-making as a way of rethinking different ways of moving forward. We were constantly in a state of reevaluating how the Corps, what the Corps' mandate is within the continental systems and within American understandings of flood control infrastructure. And so we can talk about speculative design proposals for the future, but I think Matthew and I have been interested in digging back into some of the discussions that happened historically and get buried in the archives, may not have translated into actual proposals, but exist as part of the dialogue, and use that as a starting point to surface scenario building moments that can help us think about a way of critiquing the Corps and envisioning a different future.
Yeah, I'd also kind of add, would argue that this sort of parafictional design research really kind of instrumentalizes design beyond the convention of kind of both the projective proposal and historical research into this sort of territory where history and the writing of history, really disciplines fundamental to the formation and evolution of social ideas, realities, and imaginaries, is now a medium to kind of interrogate through the eidetic tools and techniques of design. And I think that's really powerful.
Which can bring us to description, Anthony.
Yes, that's really a perfect segue, Kristi and Matthew, to then our next section, which focuses and really, I hope, foregrounds description and in the conversation that will ensue. And in that we have two panelists. We have Elgin Cleckley, who is an assistant professor of architecture and design thinking at the University of Virginia. As the principal of empathic design and initiative, pedagogy, and practice, work focuses on intersections of identity, culture, history, memory, and place. Attending the University of Virginia in 1993 and Princeton University in 95, led to collaborations with the DLR group in Seattle, MRSA Architects in Chicago, and Baird, Samson Neuert Architects in Toronto. Before joining UVA's design thinking program in 2016, he was the 3D group leader and design coordinator at the Ontario Science Centre in Toronto. Empathic design activates design studios, seminars, grant projects, and current design projects such as the Charlottesville Memorial for Peace and Justice and the City of Lynchburg's Darrington Neighborhood Plan. Elgin is a recipient of the 2020 AXA Diversity Achievement Award and the Dumbarton Oaks Mellon Fellowship in Urban Landscape Studies, supporting the development of his forthcoming 2021 book with Island Press, Empathic Design. And we're also joined by John Dean Davis, an architectural and environmental historian and assistant professor at Ohio State University. His primary research is on technology, design, construction, and the environment in the 19th century Americas. John is currently working on a book manuscript on engineering and landscape in the US South during Reconstruction. So John and Elgin, in some ways, both of you dealt in your texts with the power of language to give markedly different meanings and senses of belonging to the land. John, in your review of two books, Gold Famed Citrus by Claire Watkins and Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel, you touch upon the capacity of writers to cast natural elements with phantasmagorical roles, such as with a dune which becomes a mythical destroyer of worlds and a protagonist of environmental doom. And Elgin, your text challenges the mythology of an all-American experience of a coast-to-coast trip and foregrounds how vastness and immensity of the Americas wield tremendous power in policing the movements of many and the color lines they inscribe. We have two questions for both of you. And so the first one is, could both of you highlight specific moments in when someone's description of the land in your respective pieces significantly altered your perception? And the kind of second part to that question is really, as opposed to some narratives, description takes its cues from reality. What would you consider the role of description to be in the work of spatial designers? Maybe we start with Elgin and then go to John.
Thank you very much, Anthony, and happy to be here. Looking at this idea of altering perception, the core reference for my piece is Isabel Wilkerson's Warmth of Other Suns, and its symbolic descriptions of changing land from wet green to dry dust alter your perception. Wilkerson describes the westward journey of Robert Joseph Pershing Foster. Foster was an ambitious surgeon. He journeys from Monroe, Louisiana to California to escape the caste system of the South in April 1953. It's a journey of nearly 2,000 miles that he found out he'd have to do without stopping. In the section of the book titled Exodus, we feel like we're a passenger behind the wheel of his 1949 Buick Roadmaster, burgundy with white tires, sharp-toothed grille. Foster recalls stories of a motel in Lordsburg, New Mexico, which is about 766 miles away, that will take in black lodgers while driving over riverbeds through the Stockton Plateau. He gets parallel to the Texas Pecos Trail near Del Rio. And the shift of land from dry dust is a mirror, reflections and fine particles of the distances, the dangerous and inhospitable conditions African Americans traveled to escape the South. Years after the fact, he'd remember in vivid detail the exhaustion of driving west across Texas, without knowing where segregation ended, where he could find a place to sleep, where he could even safely stop his car. He kept an eye out for Confederate flag bumper stickers, and he wound up traveling across 3 states without rest. From wet green to dry dust, from Jim Crow to James Crow, the shifting land, things were no different, and to Foster felt even worse as it wasn't the South. It's too late to turn back, and now what on earth am I heading to, he said. You know, you must have been ready to cry right about here, says his Isabel Wilkerson's mother, in a reenactment Wilkerson took of Foster's journey decades later for warmth in the same changing land. Retracing this migration route, Wilkerson's navigated the dry dust, not able to reenact the most painful aspects of the drive. As they almost fell asleep, the wheel near Yuma, Arizona, they get a hotel room deep in the dry dust, the one thing Foster so desperately needed that long night in 1953. And for this second question, this idea of looking at description, the cues from reality, this idea that description needs to take inclusive spatial goals, it requires discourse consisting of empathic narrative development. Those cues from reality tell a full narrative in our detailing. It needs deeper investigation and open discovery of layers of natural, social, cultural, historical, and economic. Isabel Wilkerson's methodology speaks to this in the creation of Worth of Other Sons, also the way that we speak about ourselves as a university, recognizing the lands of the Monacan people, also acknowledging the enslaved laborers. But Catherine McKittrick and Clyde Woods speak to this in Black Geographies and Politics of Place. This idea of spatial understanding, which is mentioned in the piece, starts at the door of no return, transatlantic slave trade, and then also moving across the mysteries of the ocean floor. It sets to the slave market in Charleston, plantation order, Jim Crow surveillance. What's important here is to include social spatial events so that we can start thinking about how lives of subaltern subjects are shaped by and shaping the imaginative, three-dimensional social and political contours of human geographies.
Thank you, and I think that description captures very nicely both the kind of ability to retrieve, but also to project, right? And I think is a nice then moment to speak to John's piece with respect to almost a kind of speculative fiction and the environment, and kind of retrieving or projecting certain futures that he studies in his book reviews.
Right. Yeah. Thank you, Anthony, and thank you to all of you for inviting me back to my alma mater here. This is fun. I'm going to say that this time period coincides exactly with my daughter's bedtime, so you might hear some sounds of resistance from downstairs. Don't worry about that. Okay. So to answer the question about the kind of the description that was personally moving. So Claire V. Watkins's book is pretty wild. I highly recommend it if you haven't read it. It's the kind of the protagonist of the book is this gigantic sand dune in the Mojave that is getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and it's like eating cities, and it ate Las Vegas, and so this kind of looming wild landscape that it represents the climate crisis, and she takes several attempts to try to describe it, but always kind of her characters always kind of give up describing it because it's impossible to describe. So she writes about it. She says that trying to look at it is like a headache where our eyeballs scraped the limits of our vision, or rather our imagination, because it was a painting we were seeing that we stood at the sanctioned rim of the real deal. So in kind of thinking about this question and about kind of speculation, I think language is important. And I think also it's important that your perception is always personal, and it's always going to be kind of autobiographical. And so, thinking about Watkins's work, it had a particular resonance with me and made me kind of want to write it, because it reminded me of kind of the first landscape writer that I encountered who really really said something to me, and that was I was introduced to the work of the Irish poet Seamus Heaney, the late Seamus Heaney, in Jesuit school as a kind of teenager. And what I appreciate about Heaney is that his word choice was always just like absolutely precise in English and in the kind of what he called the ivied Latins of churchmen, which spoke to a kind of bookish teenager, the bookish teenager I was. So he describes, a flower's calyx. He describes the railroad as an immaculate line and shine of cogged rails. He has this poem where he describes his lover like a fortification, an earthwork, essentially. And it's absolutely beautiful. And what it gave to me was this idea about how we appreciate landscape words and how they feel in your mouth and how they sound when they come out in speech. And as I've grown older, I've kind of come to understand more about what he was trying to do with his obsession with bogs and the kind of communicating the pain and the labor and really just the layering of history that happens in these landscapes. He talks about his father cutting peat, and this famous meditation on the labor of writing is similar to working in the landscape. And so Watkins is kind of like barreling, almost stream of conscious, just like attempts to try to grapple with these big things and kind of arrive at work and pain and then this fleeting notion of the real deal, which it's like a pop notion, but it's so pertinent when we talk about landscapes that it really drew me to that work and made me want to write about it. So I think that the speculative side, the post-apocalyptic side, is something that sure I indulge in, but really it was her relationship with the landscape that came through in her writing that really that drew me in. And then to answer the second question, which is about should designers care about description? And Anthony, I think that in your prologue to the issue, I completely agree with your case that you make for description as a practice that shouldn't just be seen as a prologue to doing design work, but is an essential kind of thing to cultivate in oneself. And I, in my kind of transition from being a designer to being kind of more of a writer, I've thought about this a lot. And I read, years ago, this piece by Rebecca Solnit, who said that the important thing to do is just to read widely, and to read in time periods that you wouldn't, and to read in time periods and genres that are completely unfashionable, and to do that because you have to replace your metaphors, you have to replenish your metaphors. That we only have certain amounts of metaphors, and like me, I always fall back on household and theater and the book of nature and architecture and structure, and I overuse these metaphors, and in order to not become cliched as writers, you have to replenish those metaphors or find different ones. And I think the same is true for designers as well. The metaphors structure the way you think, and that necessarily will have an effect on the instrumentalization that you put forward in the end. And the last thing I'll comment on is I just recently read this really amazing short piece. It's 3 pages long, called Expanse, by the anthropologist Kristen Simmons, who was involved in the Standing Rock syllabus and all of that. And she writes this about how expanse is a really troublesome word, that there's so much about a kind of naked tabula rasa landscape. When we talk about the American West as an expanse, we imply that it could be immediately filled up, or we imply that the thing you have to do is start designing immediately. And she, says that that's not true. There are all sorts of Native American people that are living there, but also there's all sorts of customs and structures that are there as well. And so I think that when a designer is confronted with expanse, that is an invitation for description first, and always kind of first.
Thank you. I mean, I think both of those responses were fantastic. And if I have a kind of very pithy follow-up question, because of just how provocative and evocative both of your contributions are to the journal, it has to do with a sense of the subjectivity of immensity that I think you both touch on in markedly different ways. And so, I mean, for some, clearly kind of immensity is almost like a cartographic affair, whereas for others, it's very much a lived experience and on the ground, so to speak. So I think my follow-up question would be, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts about where those two forms of experience, maybe even knowledge, intersect. And I know I'm putting you both on the spot, but I'm curious to hear where you see kind of the subjectivity of immensity from, say, the very cartographic, we almost kind of saw that with the Mississippi, or even in the description of the Jeffersonian land ordinance grid, versus the kind of immensity, the subjectivity of a lived experience that I think also comes through in markedly different ways in both your pieces.
I can speak to it. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead, John. Sorry.
Okay. Okay. Sorry about that. So I'm at the risk of cannibalizing a paper that I'm going to be giving about Rainer Banham in like 2 days, but that's okay because it's to a different audience, so we can just pretend that I'm not saying the same thing here. But so Rainer Banham, goes out in the desert and he has this religious experience in the West. He sees this telescope, he's a British architectural historian. He's really an art historian from the Courtauld, and he sees this like the solar telescope with this flaming orb 200 feet above the desert, and he just has this epiphany where it, like, he says that it obliterates all of the iconography that he learned at the Courtauld, and is a changed man afterwards. And I think that the only reason why he could have that experience is because the American West is so completely engineered and is just like that he's not seeing nature out there. He's seeing this totally constructed concentration of all of his hopes and dreams as a futurist. And Don DeLillo talks about this too in his famous novel Underworld, where there's the guy driving through the desert in his rental car sees the rental car as the culmination of everything about America. It was like this stupid generic Ford sedan that he's driving is like the culmination of everything essentially out there. And I think that there are these moments that we would say are banal, but really represent all of the forces that are there and are present. And I find endlessly fascinating, and I try to get my students to find them fascinating too, with some luck.
I'll add to that the idea of cartography and the overlap lived experience really is seen in cities where the endpoints are the Great Migration. You get this amazing moment where you see this overlap of the life and the vitality that we look at for cities is actually the product of that overlap. And now you have this amazing moment where there's a design revolution happening. Good example is the work of Zena Howard in Los Angeles with the Crenshaw district, where there's now iconography, exhibitions, street design that actually traces now this idea of the history that actually the lived experience that connected, that made the cartography to come to Los Angeles. The idea of Foster's endpoint is now a way that defines space in a city and now becomes a way of regional identity and pride. You can imagine that that's a new way of thinking about design in every American city where there's been this shift, where there's been this moment of migration, which even becomes more intense now when you think about the reverse migration that's happening to locations in the South, in cities such as Atlanta. You have this proof that now that moving, that merging back and forth is now creating new and dynamic spaces that really speak to inclusiveness, telling a full narrative.
Thank you. I think those responses then set up very nicely the next. Elgin, we couldn't have tried to choreograph it better, and we didn't. But that setting up the next panel, which is on reimagination. So I hand it over to Dan.
So again, in this section, we're going to be focused on reimagination and territory, and how, of course, they're intertwined in today's discussion. And we are joined by Beth Meyer. Landscape architecture is a socio-ecological spatial practice with its own vocabularies and theories. Yet discourse about the designed landscape is hampered by reliance on interpretations by those outside our field. Since the late 1980s, Elizabeth K. Meyer, Merrill D. Peterson Professor, University of Virginia School of Architecture, has addressed this problem by producing a substantial body of theory and criticism that has altered how practitioners around the world create new landscape imaginaries. Peter Waldman, who is the William R. Kanan Professor at the University of Virginia School of Architecture. Since the 1970s, he has been an architect and educator, teaching first at Princeton, then at Rice University, and currently at the University of Virginia, where he is now firmly grounded at the Piedmont condition. His extensive residential practice has been concerned with the climatic house constructed according to specifications for construction executed by nomads, surveyors, and lunatics. His fables of the gardener and the engineer manifest his profound respect for the spirit and resources of the renewable American urban condition. And Alonso Díaz Rickards, who is an interdisciplinary artist. His work encompasses multiple visual formats and narrative techniques, from painting and fiction to digital collage and social media as performance art. He wrote the screenplay for the short horror film Diabla, selected for competition in the Festival International de Cine Monterrey 2020. Beth, Peter, and Alonso, all of you have dealt in your text with the potentials and pitfalls of reimagining territory. Each of you, in very different ways, reconsider territory and immensity in terms of scale, materiality, and point of view. Alonso, your contribution used a single topographic map to consider what you called some recent development in our field of discourse as anything but singular or stable. In particular, you sketch out the emergence of seemingly clear boundaries, and yet they, much like political and ideological alignments, may shift. And throughout your essay, you foreground how subtly and suddenly discourse itself may shift. You conclude your piece by noting that one should not be surprised if one finds themselves in the position you thought was the enemy's. For Beth and Peter, the legacy of Thomas Jefferson's dreams and actions features prominently in your pieces in markedly different ways as an agent or proxy of reimagination, reinvention on a grand scale. Beginning with a description of William Morris' 2009 drawing titled Mr. Jefferson's Dreams, Beth goads the reader to pay attention to drawing and thick description and reminds us of the many authors and hands that have constructed the layered landscapes of the Americas, both before and since the time of Jefferson. In Villa, Village, Vastness, Peter writes in the first person about the lessons to be gleaned from the layers of history coursing throughout Jefferson's projects and of the need to routinely reassess the covenant that is created between society and space. Given how all three of you contextualize the grand ambitions of reimagining territories and how fraught such ambitions can become, as we know, what would be the application, in your opinion, of this tradition in today's physical, political, and social landscapes? Beth, perhaps you could open.
Thanks, Dan. My essay was about a drawing that I obsessed about. I didn't win it in the art auction at the School of Architecture, and Bill gave me an extra copy. I want to say a word about his background because I think that helps to understand the context for the drawing and the question that you've posed to us. Bill was a colleague, an architect, an urban designer, the author of an incredible little book called Civilizing Terrains, which I found in the early 1990s. Herbert Mouchamp, the New York Times architectural critic, described Bill and his late wife, Catherine, as the most important urbanists in North America in the early 1990s. On the basis of his interest in landscape and territory as the precondition and motivation, inspiration for North American US architecture and urbanism. So before the landscape urbanists, 10 years before that, they were making a case through drawings like Jefferson's Dreams, but a whole series of extraordinary drawings that the continent was not only immense, but full of history and of nature. My interpretation of that drawing is clearly dated in 2016. It's a snapshot of the drawing as I saw it then, a simple line drawing of figures and fields and flows that fill and animate our vast continent, the works of colonists and Native Americans, the movements of birds and beasts and all kinds of infrastructural systems. Underlying all, landscape is both a source and a resource. Today, after a quite extraordinary couple of years, I read the drawing very differently. And I want to just share a few sentences from my essay to help you understand why that is. Marsh's drawing does not depict America as a dichotomous geography of red and blue, rural and urban, but a territory of socio-ecological entanglement, undergirded by myths and dreams. I wonder if we have the audacity to challenge old foundation myths and create new dreams. Who benefited from the bounty that the United States and some of our ancestors accrued through the exploitation and exploration of this marvelous territory? Who lost or was marginalized during that process? And what are the contemporary moral obligations of recognizing those entanglements, as well as those of the human and the non-human? I can't help but see my blinders in those questions and in Bill's thick descriptions of the American landscape. Yes, a remarkable territory full of nature and history, but silent on 400 years of lived experience, labor and life of African enslaved laborers. The drawing makes me think how much I love that landscape and how much I still have to learn about it.
Thank you, Beth. Alonso, do you want to take it from there?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you, Dan. And thank you also to Anthony and Felipe for organizing this. So the piece I wrote this last summer, and I was sort of thinking of all of the events of the spring and the summer, and of this pervasive sense I had of, whether across political discourse in the media or within academic fields or in dinner conversations with friends and on social media, trying to have dialogue felt like an increasingly impossible proposition. Like there's just the sense that any common ground that we used to presume was there is increasingly lost and eroded. So starting from that thought, I wrote this piece and I used this visual map to kind of like construct my thoughts around it, and extending the idea of common ground to sort of a theoretical immensity, kind of trying to address like, if there is no immensity that can encompass all perspectives within which I can stand and see everyone else standing in it somehow in relation to what I can see, then the possibility of dialogue becomes very difficult. And so sticking with that metaphor, I used it to try to describe that, what I think is the kind of continuing phenomenon. So to speak to your question, like how do we reimagine territories going forward or, in this moment, I think that the changes of the last year maybe make it feel like we might be in a slightly more stable place. I think most of us would like to think so, but it seems to me like a lot of this is still happening, things that perhaps we used to take for granted, or immensities that we kind of relied upon to be able to construct a shared project or a shared purpose, are all up for grabs, being questioned and being kind of reimagined every day. So I don't know if that's a great answer to your question, but and maybe it's a slightly pessimistic one. But my sense is, this conceptual immensity is perhaps both necessary in order to stake a common project that is legible to anyone who participates in it, whether that's in politics or in academia or within an artistic discipline. And so it's kind of challenging when you maybe stake a position in what you thought was a common goal, and then 6 months later it turns out that thing that you committed to is exactly the opposite of what you should be doing, and that's no longer wanted. So I don't know, I don't have an answer, but that's my contribution to this thinking.
Well, Peter, perhaps because your piece deals quite a bit with the idea of common ground and how to bring people under the same sort of frame of thinking and discussing certain subjects, perhaps you could elaborate from there.
Sure, I have to thank you and Anthony and certainly Felipe, but all of you, particularly from what I've gotten out of the past hour of what we've kind of shared together in this kind of a forum. I guess because I'm the last of the series, I feel that I need to be responsive. My comments are responsive to the general question and to the immediacy of those that I've heard from now. So at the end of this day, I must be responsive to the shared temporal agenda. That means becoming, building as a verb in a way, okay, of total strangers, specifically Alonso, and to dear long-term colleagues, all of you, specifically Beth, in this session. First to Alonso, who initiated his stewardship of a field, I love that phrase, with a sense of orientation to the east, going on to the south, etc. And Beth also prefaces the East Coast as coordinates to read the Morris drawing, Mr. Jefferson's Dreams, of the academical village as an ideogram of the future growth of the continental United States. Where Alonso is a steward, as a witness, a testigo in my terms, I am a field guide. I am not from this tentative Piedmont condition, but I have not been alone in this daydream, though I have been lingering here a while. I ask my students two questions as I do myself. From where do you come and where do you now find yourself? Perhaps in the Americas, plural, we are all nomads. I tell them I am from the East Coast of the United States. I show them a map, rather close to East Coast of the United States by way of Prague and Vienna and the west side of Manhattan. In an apartment with 9 huge windows looking north, with only indirect reflected light and one deep window facing a courtyard of trees in the dining room looking south. On Sunday mornings, when I was unimaginably young, I found myself and my world turned magical when I hit the carpet to hold in my hands direct light tangibly reflected in the dust. I graduated to mining mica shortly thereafter. This recurrent sense of orientation as nomad, accountable surveyor, and a certifiable lunatic, I have also assigned to Monticello, the villa, the academical village, and the vastness of Jefferson's continental imagination. Next subject beyond orientation, which I think we share as a temporal agenda, as the sun rises in the east, goes through the day and sets to the west. So the next issue I'd like to share is an interrogation of the word, what continental might mean. My response is as a four-faced Janus, north, south, east, and west. This perspective has always been east and west for me, okay? And when thinking about the United States is America. But ever since 1967, the connective longitudinal line from New York City to Princeton led me to my Peace Corps years south of the equator onto Arequipa, Peru, which was 50 miles, by the way, though it's the same straight line. New York faces the Atlantic. Take a straight line on down, you get to Arequipa, Peru, which is 50 miles from the Pacific Ocean. The continent was a bigger figure of the Americas from the poles stretching beyond between the Atlantic and the Pacific, united by one north-south longitudinal line, where I was part of, at that time, Judy Collins' Both Sides Now, a fortuitous adolescent moment, all of which refers to my appreciation of Jefferson, not as a heroic figure, but a growing one, and a reimagining one, I guess I could say. Finally, as I recount guiding students of future generations, I am never alone on this journey. I am, as Jefferson, in conversation with Ariadne and Aeneas, made present by colleagues Richard Wilson and Bill Marsh, and even at the end of my piece with Homer, the blind poet, who confronts as a statue the rotunda with deep insight with the next generation at his feet. Dan, you write of the challenges of the provocation of, quote, pitfalls fraught again and again, as I also respond with the frictions, blisters, and scars of hybrid ties. This essay was first written before the election of 2016, that election, and the Seville events of 2017. In 2020, I responded with a postscript with a patchwork approximation of an evolving collage to sustain the aspiration of an ethical agenda of connective tissues. I have traveled from I to he, meaning Jefferson, to we. Who is the we, as Beth suggests? The last image is Berstadt's Mount Cochrane without a human in sight, but a fat fish in a crystal lake and a hungry bear in wild pursuit. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. Anthony, perhaps a follow-up question from your side?
Certainly. Thank you. I thought those were both, well, not both, all three were nice setups for, I think, a set of questions that have animated the discussions that Dan and I have been having about the project, and certainly the three of us as editors with Justin. One is the kind of obviously bigger than big is a kind of spatial concept that has a lot to do with sheer size of the continent, etc. But I was wondering if any of you, and the three of you, and then maybe even more broadly, could elaborate on how we might understand immensity, especially this group of you, as a political project. It seems to me that you're each of you in very different ways are speaking to that, and certainly not just in the work, but in the responses you gave to the questions that Dan posed to you about immensity as a kind of political project. What that entails, it's, I guess, to use the language that Dan mentioned, kind of its possibilities, but certainly also its pitfalls. Maybe Alonso, yeah, you should take it first.
All right. So, I mean, I think from today and also from a lot of the writing in the issue, we're familiar with this idea of American expansion and kind of the problematics of that historically. And I think we want to get away from that sense of like immensity. Any type of immensity politically means a totalizing vision and is kind of undesirable. But in my piece, I'm also interested in immensity as possibility. And so I guess I liken it to the idea of the commons. And I think, we can see that on like as a political platform, but I also think about like the virtual immensities of like social media discourse. Every time we have a new social network, there's this utopian Silicon Valley kind of promise about what possibilities that will mean. And so it's a sort of virtual immensity that we always encounter, and it gets politicized and it becomes fragmented and it becomes warped and distorted and maybe poisonous. I mean, we can think of like the evolution of Twitter all the way up to like last month and, its current kind of condition. So I think the politics of immensity can also work in that way. Like, how is an immensity, is like a premise of immensity necessary for political communication to occur? And how do you maintain it? How do you keep it productive?
I don't know if I'm answering the question or not, but I'm responding to Alonso and things I was thinking about, Anthony, as you were asking the question. I was really taken with John and Elgin's references to authors and poets who were writing about the lived experience of landscape. And it just made me realize that so often with the issue of immensity or territory in the design fields, there is a default assumption that that can be understood through the simplicity of layered maps. And I have to admit to a certain fondness for the word entanglement versus layer, because what is immense when one tries to deal with the entanglements of territory is the act of interpretation that requires putting yourself in the position of so many different actors and agents, human and non-human, and then within the human condition, the diversity of the experience of that vastness. So I think what's kind of amazing to me is, you know, at the age of almost 65, I wish I were, because I'd be on a vaccine list, but almost 65, I feel like I know so little about the vastness of this place I've been studying for 45 years, which is humbling, but it's also invigorating. And so I keep going, I keep thinking about the description of the sublime that Lyotard made 30 years ago, where he shifts it from the spatial immensity and talks about duration and what it means to think about time and duration as being immense and unknowing and vast. And when I think back on the conversations today, I'm moving away from the association with spatial scale and thinking about the complexity of interpretation, the humility that it takes to do that, and also the incredible work that's ahead to understand those entanglements.
In response to this, I might say that my first thought that came to mind, there were two of them. When I was 5 years old, I went to Madison Square Garden and I saw Ringling Brothers' three-ring circus, etc. It was vast, it was immense. There were animals, there were humans, everything was just happening across time, to use that temporal agenda. It was like the kaleidoscopic thing of the entire world within this, not stadium, whatever it was, presentation. But then I also thought, when you were asking about it, that Jefferson had his own circus of sorts, his entry hall, where you walk in and he shows the maps of the known world, the continents of Africa and South America and Europe and those conditions that were there. I don't think Australia would happen to be there, but you walk into the immensity and the vastness of the world together with mastodon bones and then white-tailed deer and stuff like that. And your eye just went, again, like the circus, again and again, the world again, across time. Every place you turn, it seemed like a pretty good place to me. It's like an encyclopedia I used to read from A to Z and Z to A when I was at 8 or 10 or something like that. There was just so much there. And I think that is a little bit connected to Alonso's and maybe Beth's comments of the variety within us humans as species, as well as the animals and other forces in this world. It's fantastic as a architectural subject to imagine, I guess, simply that verb, to imagine, to reimagine, and never stop doing it over time, which is what one I have gotten out of this presentation this afternoon. So it's a way to live. It is a way to live responsibly if you don't get paralyzed, but begin to be optimistic. I have borrowed it from Ila Berman when she's what's it called? Optimistic, pathologically optimistic. I love that phrase. You used it the first time I encountered you, and I think that is maybe what the ethical essence of what to be in this place, in this continent, in this hemisphere condition, or in this world, I guess, to be pathologically optimistic, to be able to render visible in our minds the possibilities.
Okay, thank you so much for the three of you for these comments. I think they're really thought-provoking, and as we move forward to open the floor to questions that we didn't author, which I think is a welcome change. I would just say that some of the things that really strike me, and again, Anthony, Justin, and I were discussing some of these things, of course, when we were, in the very long time it took us to produce this issue, because as you may know, this project was also immense in the leotard sense, right? So it took so long, as Beth mentioned, some of the pieces were written a couple of years ago already. And we have some of these conversations right now about how much time it took to tackle immensity, right? So it was so complex in a way. The project itself became so complex just because, in a way, it reflected its subject matter. But to me, I think your comments, and especially the last trio right now, really highlighted the boundaries that we face, boundaries of description, first of all, that we sometimes lack the language, lack the metaphors, as John was saying before, to even translate what we witness and what we experience. Also boundaries of perception, as some of you mentioned, we sometimes don't see everything, we don't know everything, we cannot know some of the experiences of others who inhabit the same territory sometimes, and also the boundaries of discipline, which I think we didn't, we didn't talk about much, but I think it's also part of something we need to consider, right? What are the essential, let's say, blind spots that are sort of grounded in our discipline? Perhaps Alonso was, perhaps because he's not from the discipline, technically speaking, from the same discipline, the design discipline, perhaps this was closer to what you were describing. But some of these moments in which our training just doesn't allow us to see certain things related to the subject matter, I think are really important points to reflect upon. And with that, we're going to open it up to some questions we have. What do we have? Anthony, do you see anything?
Yes, I have a question for us from Jose Ibarra, which is, it says, I'm intrigued by the contributor's understanding of immensity or vastness leads to the notion of memory, political, social, cultural, etc. I wonder if any of the panelists could speak more to this, to the ways in which an understanding of immensity or vastness seems to lead to memory, the political, the social, the cultural.
Even though this certainly wasn't the territory that I started with, maybe I could frame this, and this is coming off of Beth's comments in relation to the notion of duration, let's say, as the thickness of time, or the idea of immanent and embodied time, that we can think about two other kinds of immensity. The immensity of dimensions, not as measure, but as the dimensions of interactions or modes of experience. So immensity is a form of complexity in that way, which is the greater challenge, right? And the second kind of immensity, which is the immensity of intention rather than extension. That on the one hand, we've moved beyond the notion of territorial expansion, to the global and the planetary. And at the same time, the great challenge of let's say, the immensity of intention as a kind of depth or thickness to things, and whether that's the, 400 years of labor and life hidden, right? That Beth had referred to, whether it's the stories, the memories, the things that are unseen, that's a kind of complexity and immensity that goes far beyond the way that we think of territory in extension. And I would sort of start it with perhaps that.
Yeah, I think, Ila's comments resonate with mine, and I might just say something that's so pointed that like I might take it for granted, but others don't. So much of the reading that I've done about the term landscape ties vastness and immensity to national identity in the United States. And that there's a certain conception of the emptiness of that land and its kind of openness for exploration and discovery. There are so many myths and memories embedded in the word immense and vast when it comes to the North American condition and to US national identity. And there's so many memories that are suppressed and so many lived experiences that are ignored when those terms persist without interrogation. So when thinking about the continental United States and the ways in which my own field emerges at this very time, right, in the early 19th century, I can't talk about space or landscape without talking about memory and meaning and myth. That it's not a measurable scalar thing. It is totally entangled with cultural issues.
Yeah, I mean, if I could add briefly to that point and sort of in answering Jose's question, I think that sort of on the one hand, sort of they're tying sort of issues of immensity and landscape, sort of vastness to memory, but I think also to political dimensions and perspectives of immensity that benefit certain points of view more than others, right? So for example, if you look at it in the context of South America from the perspective of resource extraction, the territory is immense and its operation is at the level of the globe. In fact, the number one resource that gets extracted from the continent, it's what now has been labeled as virtual water. Basically water that's hidden in other products, right? Citruses, soy, etc. So from a point of view of economic development, the vastness of the territory is immense. It's the entire continent and extends to a global footprint. If you look at it in terms of immensity through the free movement of people, for example, it becomes very different, right? Goods can move through customs with no problem. But when it actually happens, when it's about sort of the movement of people, the free sort of a movement across borders, across certain regions, there are many things that actually sort of hold back a large sort of a large percentage of the population in that regard. So it's sort of that notion of immensity, for example, is primarily tied to a political development perspective that hides many others. So I think for me, sort of in going back to the initial points of Anthony and Dan's question, a lot of it has to do with not only the way that we sort of debundle notions of immensity, but also the way that we sort of critically assess whose perspective are we sort of addressing, or which perspectives are we addressing from in regards to sort of notions of immensity.
In the 1980s, Diana Agros wrote an essay on the city between memory and amnesia, and the word immense might seem I'm using the wrong thing, empty, as opposed to vastness for me in an encyclopedic sense it is full. So I choose to use the word vastness, not big, which is dimensional perhaps, but vast, within which one enters into it, not because it's empty and exploring there, but actually full of the vitalities, temporal and natural and everything else along there. So the curse of amnesia, which is what very often we're going through now, is when people are forgetting the utility, perhaps, an appreciation of history, okay, and all these stories told, mythic, etc., that actually still might be vital in it. And so it is the fullness of knowledge, to get back to, I think, an earlier question about knowledge, which was asked about of Elgin and John. The world is very full if you take the time to read it, to see it, and to say, no, it's not empty at all. It is a field without limits, I suppose, which Alonso talks a bit about in his project, I think. So it's useful for me to think about its opposite of our current state, which I think is one is amnesiatic, if I could use that phrase.
I wanted to just maybe talk a little bit about the political angle that I think a lot of people have brought up, which I think is absolutely essential when talking about immensity in the landscapes of the Americas. And, you know, yeah, I think that the idea of immensity in terms of extraction, yeah, is definitely problematic. But I think we need to continue to think about it as a frame of reference. And from my work on Reconstruction, I mean, that is an immense question. How do you form a multiracial republic? And it wasn't answered, and it still hasn't been answered. They posed the question, and they tried, and there's a long history of this kind of politically gigantic questions that then have effects in the built environment. Bolivar thinking that he's going to do something, in a go up against Spain is also another immense question. And I think that if we're going to confront climate change, you absolutely have to think on the immense political scale of the questions that have often been asked in this continent, beyond just kind of what are the limits to colonization, essentially.
Thanks. We have another question we'd like to ask before concluding from Linda. You have referred to scale quite negatively. I think she refers to us, Anthony, as a refuge for designers who fail to engage with immensity. How do you imagine a better grappling to look like? Perhaps one of you could open, and while I think about that.
One of the things that Matthew and I have tried to chase down within the core is narratives of those either individuals or sub-offices within the core that were trying to make the transition across from an institution that began as part of the War Department, but then became embedded in communities and had to absorb the stories and make decisions about people's property. That the scale becomes in some ways irrelevant when we're in the letters trying to explain the potential consequences of moving cemeteries, or moving some cemeteries and not others, or moving the church but leaving the interred graves. And I think that is a way of absorbing immensity without actually reckoning with scale. And the struggle that you see within the core is that stays incredibly partitioned from the public presentation of what the core seeks to represent. And so you see the kind of messiness of coming to terms with scale or time or temporal questions, and that doesn't have the opportunity to see daylight or find a public footing.
Do we have any other? Go ahead, Beth. Perfect.
Well, I was wondering if one way to answer that question was to start to build on Elgin's comment about the kind of compression of distance that happens when somebody migrates and migrates back, right? Like, Kristi was talking about the fact that decisions that affect one system have implications at another that aren't always recognized. The other aspect of contemporary experience is the fact that scale is often compressed, that places exist in the same place because, I say this as a nomad, right? Living in 8 places before I went to college. So scale, I think, is something that is subjective, not always measured. It's not just about big out here and detailed in here. It has these relationships. And so, the negative aspect of scale is just thinking about it in terms of big or little, right? When there's so much more to it that's qualitative and subjective and also part of the new imaginaries that you're seeking to surface through this issue of Manifest.
I'm maybe going to jump in on in relation to what Beth has raised, because I think that on the one hand, when we think about scale, it's the operation through the metric as being something that is expeditious in the sense that it's always operating through a form of rarefaction, that it's about the thinning out of the material real, which is itself a mode of perception in order to measure something. But perhaps we could think about the specificity of scales of things, right? Which is, it's coming back to this notion of embodiment, but actually saying that there, even though any entity, whether it's an urban condition, a territory, a landscape, et cetera, might be thought, within multiple scales, and thinking across those scales is going to change the way we understand that thing. There is also a scale to that thing, just in the same way there's a potential duration or temporality to it. And it might be thinking of the qualitative aspects of scale as they are tied to things themselves. And in this sense, because I was thinking about, the immensity of the landscape is of the continent, for example, is very different if we think about it in terms of geological time, the time that its own time of evolution, where the scale of that immensity is somehow tied to its temporal evolution, which is very different than the temporalities and the scales of those who live upon it or live in it. And I think that we need to be thinking of scale in a slightly different way.
And maybe to add to some of these questions of scale and also jumping in on the duration question, I think one form of immensity that we haven't really touched upon, but I think is really important and perhaps also pertains to questions of design, is the sense of virtual immensity. If we think of the increasing amount of time and also just sheer power that it takes to, say, mine the next Bitcoin, and what that means in terms of resource extraction, and how exponentially everything that our contemporary way of existing requires completely exceeds what each one of us can individually conceive or even think about clearly. And I'm just talking about like all of the machines that are necessary to keep this going. That's a sort of immensity, right, that we haven't really talked about, and partly because it kind of exists within our capacity as opposed to being a given immensity of the geographic territory that we've spoken more about, but I think it's a really important one for our times.
Well, and Alonso, it's kind of perfect timing because we also got a question that touches on this question of the virtual. It's from it comes from Michael, who asks, "I'm thinking about the immensity of power and poverty for those who are subject to them. In a favorite American novel, Country of the Pointed Firs from 1896 by Sarah Jewett, an impoverished widow living on the Maine seacoast describes a chance sighting of Queen Victoria in London as the central event of her life. Back in America, she surrounds herself with images of the Queen, ignoring immense Atlantic Western prospects that surround her in favor of the intimate immensity of her relationship with memory and the Queen. The question is, what of the subject for whom even an IKEA cabinet is immense, expensive, aspirational, distant, or a subject who finds the universe in the territory of their iPhone?
That is the immensity of intention. That's all I'll say.
The tragedy of surrogates as opposed to immediacy.
That might be a fantastic line to then conclude with and turn it back over to Felipe.
Yes, well, just a brief couple of words. One, to thank all the participants for being here today. Of course, our audience who's on YouTube Live, and especially to Anthony, Dan, and Tal, who's been sort of working very hard behind the scenes. When he said it was a physical virtual experience, I didn't literally know it was going to be a physical model with a small stage. So I thought that was quite phenomenal. And of course, a huge thank you to sort of the editors at Manifest for bringing a cohort of faculty, alumni, and a distinguished guest, Alonso, together on a Zoom grid. I think it's during the era of social distancing, it's been great to be able to reconnect with sort of this common artifact together, which is the third issue of Manifest. Having said that, I will also say that, of course, Manifest is an independently funded publication. So if you liked what you saw today, take Manifest home. And somebody in the chat had asked if Manifest issue 1 is available. I know those are hard to come by, but maybe Anthony or Dan, you want to say if there are copies available? I guess the answer is no. I think issue number 1 is sold out, but hopefully at some point it might be reprinted. But once again, thanks to everyone. I think YouTube will stop going live in a second, but all the panelists should stay on the grid for 30 seconds.